Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Truth Report once again. I am Joe Emilio, fellow contributor, and I'm joined today by a good friend and fellow contributor of Truth Report, David Ansara from the Free Market Foundation. We're going to be talking about the private sector, and specifically, is the private sector saving South Africa? A very good expert to talk on the subject is David Ansara. David Ansara, welcome to Truth Report. Good to
Hey,
have you
Joe.
here.
Yeah, great to be here. Good to chat to you.
Do you think the private sector is saving South Africa?
Yeah, so if you think of your daily life, all of the things that you need, the goods, the services, the activities that you engage in, most of those things are going to be provided by the private sector. And the private sector is not just one thing. It doesn't have a central control or management. It's the diffusion of all of these different businesses, individuals who are trading with one another, offering these goods and services in exchange for value, whether that's money or other kinds of exchanges. And the accumulative effect of all of that is that we can enhance our lifestyles, we can get food on our tables, we can do all of the things that make living in a modern world possible.
Right.
And so when you contrast that with the goods and services that the government provides, and those are actually quite extensive, there's about 32% of South Africa's overall economic activity is produced by the state, actually, through various investments like in infrastructure and running the police and the courts and the armed services and all of these things. But if you think of your interactions with the government, often the quality of those is not as good. So if you go to Home Affairs to try and get your ID document, or you're trying to get your driver's license, I don't know about you, Joe, but my driver's license expired a long time ago, and I diligently went to go and apply for a new one. And this was about 5 or 6 months ago or so, and I still haven't gotten the new one.
Maybe you shouldn't admit that on camera.
But yeah, so I kind of walk around with drive around with a piece of paper, which is my
Yeah.
temporary license. But the reason for that is because the one printer in the country
Yeah.
that is responsible for printing these driver's license cards is broken,
Yeah.
and they can't sort out the procurement, all this stuff. And so we all have to suffer the consequences of that. So that's just one example of how the state actually breeds inefficiency. And why is that? Because they don't have the same incentives. That's why when you often go to a government department and you have a service kind of interaction, the person there is sometimes quite rude to you.
Yeah.
And what are you going to do about it is kind of the answer. So if you look at South Africa today, we see actually a lot of consequences of state failure. And there are many reasons for that, one of which is because the government tries to do more and more things.
Yeah.
It's going beyond its kind of original scope. There's a lot of scope creep, and it tries to make all of these public investments that actually are not very efficient uses of their funds. And those funds are actually taxpayer funds. That's individuals like you and I who are contributing a portion of our income to fund all of these state activities. So there's a lot of wastage, a lot of capital misallocation, a lot of these kind of vanity projects that end up not really working very well. And also because of those poor incentives, there's not enough accountability in the system to ensure good quality services there. So the private sector, and we see this in South Africa today, is actually stepping into the breach and is starting to perform a lot of the services that we traditionally would have associated with the government. So I'm from Johannesburg, and in the old days, you used to see these big red fire trucks driving around Joburg all the time. And now there are very few of them. Those used to be City of Joburg fire trucks. And on my morning runs, I sometimes run past the old fire station, and it's all like paper covering all of the windows. And
Oh boy.
you occasionally see a fire truck, but it's not looking too great. But obviously, fire services are really important. If your house catches fire, you need somebody to come put it out. And so now in many parts of South Africa, you actually have private fire services where you subscribe with an app on your phone for like under 100 Rand a month. And if there's an emergency, you just hit the emergency button and then someone will arrive and solve the problem. Potholes are the same thing. You now see companies like insurance companies starting to, of their own accord or own volition, starting to go and fill potholes in the suburbs. But I think maybe an attitude that we need to adopt in South Africa is you might not have caused the problem, but that is a problem that is now your responsibility. And, you know, I think that there is a tendency in South Africa still, and I think we need to change this mindset of the government must. I'm sure you've been at a
Yes.
braai or a dinner party and
The
somebody,
government must provide jobs, or it
yeah,
must provide healthcare, or must do this or that. Yeah.
yeah. And I think our expectations are misaligned there.
Yes.
You know, in the beginning of this conversation, we were all talking about how the government often mismanages things and is inefficient and the service staff are rude. But, you know, yet we still are pleading and begging for the government to do ever more and ever more.
Yes.
And really, I think the government should have a very narrow focus. It should be on preserving life, liberty, and property, those three things. And that means stopping people from committing grievous, violent crimes against each other, protecting people's freedoms, so upholding the rule of law, and property as well. Private property rights is very important. Having security of your property. I mean, you know this better than most with your excellent documentary. You know, if you don't have the government coming in and providing protections for private property, then you could have violent mobs seizing your assets, and then you have very little recourse. So there are many examples in South Africa of where we've over-legislated and we're trying to create this system where we have no trade-offs and where everybody benefits. But there are many problems that need to be solved. And to expect one central actor to be able to have perfect knowledge about how to solve these problems, I think is very unrealistic.
Should businesses be working with the government to solve the problem instead of taking responsibility for it?
Yeah, so we have a lot of examples of business coming to the aid of government, and those monopoly network industries that they're sometimes referred to as, those are really good examples of the failure of over-centralization and state control. And the government views these things as so-called strategic assets. They believe that you need the government controlling the infrastructure of the country, and that the government should be the entity that's pulling all of these levers and directing economic activity. And it's very tempting to think in that way, but actually successful economies are actually these emergent phenomena. They're the composite of all of these people acting in their own self-interest, but actually that creates beneficial outcomes. What we have in South Africa is some very tentative moves towards crowding in the private sector. And that's because the government can't escape the reality that a lot of these infrastructure or network industries are no longer working. I mean, when the lights go out, like they have done with Eskom, it's a very obvious manifestation of the failure of that system. And many people argue that you need a centralized monopoly, state-controlled, vertically integrated utility to provide electricity. But on a long enough timeline, those kind of entities are always going to fail. They're ripe for capture as well. So what we are seeing is, say, with Eskom now, a willingness to say, okay, we can have private generation of electricity, but no, we the government must still be responsible for transmission and distribution. And I think that that's something to be encouraged. Like we should support that. But at the same time, the government sets the price of electricity through NERSA, the National Energy Regulator of South Africa. And so that disrupts the market signal, the price signal. And prices are not just what something costs, but it's also a way of transmitting information.
Right.
And that price signals to entrepreneurs in the market that there's money to be made. And if there's a disjuncture between supply and demand, there's supply and demand tension.
Yeah.
And the price is a way of determining whether you should actually invest your time, energy, and resources in trying to participate in that market. So, every year we have Eskom going to NERSA, the regulator, and saying, please, pretty please, can we increase prices by 30%? And everybody gets outraged. And the regulator basically sucks its thumb and says, no, we'll give you 18%. It's kind of like a negotiation more than actually a price mechanism.
I feel like they get to the 30% eventually, just not right away, because the one year it's like, no, we'll give you 12. And the following year they ask again, they're like, okay, cool, we'll give you another 12 or 5 or whatever. And slowly but surely they're getting to that 30% that they originally asked for.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a...
Well, look, there is a cost to producing electricity, an objective cost. Like there's a cost of digging coal out of the ground. There's a cost to transporting it to the power station and burning it. So, and that needs to be reflected in the consumer price. And so it might be the case that actually South Africa's energy costs are undervalued, right? And so we would be an advocate for just letting it rip, basically, saying there should be no price setting, that the price should just emerge. And that might actually mean that prices might surge initially. But remember, prices are a signal. So that would signal to someone, oh, there's money to be made here if I invest in a power station or a solar plant or something like that. And then what you would see is, because new supply would come in, then you would see that price going down. And then we would get to a more healthy equilibrium. And that would also help people with their planning and so on. So I think there's a lot of problems with this monopolistic state control. The one is concentration risk. So if that's the only game in town and something goes wrong with the operations or with the management or the finances, then everybody is stuffed. That flows all the way through the economy. Fiber internet is a very good example of actually very complex infrastructure that is distributed now very widely across the country. And that was entirely private-led. And that requires digging up pavements and laying cables but all of that was done with the knowledge that there would be some kind of profit there.
There should be some sense of regulation or control. So how does the relationship between private sector and government, how should that be in order to make sure that the private sector doesn't also run the house, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so when we have this conversation, we need to understand that we're talking about human beings, and human nature is such that not everybody is an angel. You have some devils amongst us. But so you have to also, when you set policy, sort of understand that this is universal, these kind of human behavior traits. And as much as that applies to private actors, also applies to government actors, right? So just because you have somebody who calls themselves the government doesn't mean they're not subject to the same kind of shortcomings in human nature, right? So the other thing I would say is, whenever there are instances of cronyism, often that is in parallel or coincides with high degrees of state involvement, right? So when you have a big government, the stakes get higher. You need to be able to capture those levers of power in order to advantage yourself. So, in a free market where you have reduced government involvement and private actors competing with one another, this is not going to be a utopia. I think we must get away from this kind of utopian visions. But what it would do is, if there were instances in which companies or individuals committed fraud against one another, that's where you could have a role for the legal system to check and balance people's, or to check bad behavior. And that's why we have the courts and the legal system. That's very different to a statutory model where you have laws being written by parliamentarians and emerging out of the cabinet, out of various departments, telling people how they should behave and what they should do, and having lots of codes and regulations that specify how you may conduct your business, or what kind of, like something like BEE, for example, is a very good example of this. Now, you must give 26% ownership of your business to somebody else who just so happens to be a politically connected individual. We've relinquished so much power and control to the government. And this is not necessarily a benevolent government either. If you think of something like the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act, in the school sector, this has empowered politicians and bureaucrats to now override the interests of school governing bodies and parents, and to say, no, we're going to choose what kind of language policy you have. This kind of top-down approach has been shown in South Africa to not really work very well. And I think we need to reverse that. We need a bottom-up approach. And so part of that is about utilizing the skills and the expertise and the capital in the private sector to solve some of these problems.
Rail is falling apart. Electricity is falling apart. Hospitals are in complete disarray, public hospitals. Education system is also pretty much gone. So what does the Free Market Foundation have any solutions or suggestions to these issues?
Well, we do. We spend a lot of time doing research and writing reports. So this is our policy agenda for the new government. It's called Liberty First. And so it's called Liberty First because we want to put freedom first. Mm. And that should be the guiding light in any kind of policy decisions. So you ask what should be done. Well, first of all, you need to cut government spending drastically. At the moment, South Africa is spending huge amounts, about 2 trillion rand a year, on all of these projects and initiatives, and a lot of them don't work. And so you need to cut back on the size of the civil service. These are government bureaucrats. So if you think about 17% of everyone who's employed in South Africa is employed by the government. So we need those people, are not typically very productive people. We need to get them actually off of the government payroll, which is taxpayers' payroll, actually.
Yeah.
And get them working in the private sector, doing something productive, generating new value. And as a consequence of South Africa's overspending, we're now heading towards a debt crisis. So South Africa has a debt to GDP ratio of about 80%. That's next year's projection. So that means that the size of our debt is equivalent to about 80% of the entire economy. So that's really not a sustainable situation.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, many other countries around the world are also suffering from huge amounts of overspending and indebtedness. And I think that's going to be a problem that future generations are going to inherit. And that's going to create a lot of political tensions and a lot of really damaging effects.
But you guys also think that cabinet should be smaller as well. That would also help with the expense.
Yeah, so we recently released a report called Lean But Efficient, which forms part of our Liberty First series, where we argue that the cabinet needs to be cut down to 10 portfolios. So if you think of something like the Department of Small Business, that really does nothing for small businesses. I mean, you're a business owner. Have you ever had any contact with the Department of Small Business?
No. Didn't even know they existed until you said it now.
Okay. Yeah, and so, I mean, that was just created, I think, by the Zuma administration. They split off half of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, and you could very easily fold that back in and no one would know the difference. The Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, South Africans are obsessed with sport. We invest a lot in sports at schools, and the reason we have the Springboks is not because of the national department.
Yeah.
They might be the national rugby team, but actually the reason we are excellent at rugby is because we have these great rugby playing schools and a long rugby playing tradition that's well supported and funded. And I think one of my criticisms for big business in particular is that perhaps they often just let government take the lead and often are helping government to solve the problems that it itself created without addressing the core issues. And the core issues are really the policy framework in South Africa. Something like BEE, something like expropriation without compensation.
NHI.
NHI is a very good example, and I think a lot of businesses in the healthcare industry, initially when NHI was proposed, were kind of saying, okay, well, like, let's talk to the government and we accept the premise of we need universal healthcare, but not defending their own vital economic interests. And now we are seeing a lot of these industry associations taking the government to court on NHI, which I think is something to be welcomed. Part of leadership is about standing up for the people you represent and being unafraid to engage in a fight when it's needed. So I think my philosophy on this is that you should be peaceful but not harmless. You must be prepared to fight for your interests if needs be. And I think that that's an important philosophy for the private sector to take.
So once again, David, thank you for all the work that you do. Don't forget to leave a like on this video, share it far and wide. I've been Joe Emilio, your host for this discussion. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, your newsflash. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, your truth report is in.